Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. In particular, I'm going to give two different, very similar, but distinguishable ways of differentiating between Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Preface, caveat, I am not a doctor, I am not a medical researcher, I am not a nurse of any kind, I don't have any specific expertise in healthcare or medical issues. All I'm doing here is basically reporting on some of the investigations that I've done myself. And when a person starts to read about different conditions like Alzheimer's disease and dementia that afflict maybe themselves or a loved one, they run across these terms, and it's very common to then wonder about what the relationship is between the two of them. Now, in reading, I have discovered that there are a couple of different ways of making this distinction and drawing the distinction. I'm going to briefly state the two different reasons, and then I'm going to unpack them further as the video progresses. So briefly stated, the first way of differentiating dementia and Alzheimer's disease is essentially the way where dementia is considered a general term or a generic term, and Alzheimer's disease is a specific term. The second way of differentiating would be to think of dementia as a symptom or as a constellation of symptoms, and Alzheimer's or some other kind of affliction as the actual condition causing the symptom. Before I get into the details, I'll say this. One thing that the two ways of drawing the distinction have in common is that on both of them, Alzheimer's disease is a specific disease. It is a specific condition. Dementia is not a specific disease or condition. On both ways of drawing the distinction, that's the case. So when we think of Alzheimer's disease, it's a specific condition, whereas if we think of dementia, it is not. Either way you draw the distinction, and I will show you in just a moment using a couple of different web links how different authorities online seem to draw these distinctions and map onto these two distinctions the way I've just sketched them. But however you draw the distinction, the bottom line is that dementia and Alzheimer's aren't precisely the same thing. What is the difference between those two ways of drawing the distinction? So if a person thinks of dementia as a general condition, and in this regard, WebMD actually comes to mind. WebMD uses the word dementia in its article on the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease. They actually use the word dementia as a kind of a generic term for a class of conditions. So if we're thinking about dementia as a class of conditions, then we might think, well, there are a number of different types of dementia then on this particular way of differentiating the two. So you might have Lewy-Body Dementia, you might have Multi-Infarct Dementia, and Alzheimer's disease on this way of thinking about it is essentially a kind of dementia. So dementia is the generic term, and Alzheimer's disease is one type. In a similar way that, say, bear could be a general category, and black bear and grizzly bear and panda bear maybe could all be different types of bear under that general heading. Or to use a more medically oriented example, if we think about, let's say, respiratory virus as being a general term, then you might think of influenza and the common cold and so on down the line as being specific cases or specific instances of the more general category respiratory virus. So respiratory virus doesn't mean the same thing as common cold because there are other respiratory viruses like influenza. And in a similar way, dementia and Alzheimer's disease don't mean the same thing on this view because there are different kinds of dementia besides Alzheimer's disease. Having said that, Alzheimer's disease is recognized as the major form of dementia for those who are in favor of this particular word usage. A second way of drawing the distinction between dementia and Alzheimer's disease would be something like this. Dementia is, rather than designating a class, for example, a class of conditions, it's rather designating a symptom or a constellation, a group of symptoms. Usually this view is going to then go ahead and cash out the description of the symptoms in ways that are going to be generally familiar to us in terms of appealing to things like a certain erosion of memory, a certain degradation in the reasoning process and in perceptual abilities and so on. But on this view then, the word dementia actually picks out the symptom of being deficient or degraded in terms of your memory capacity and other cognitive abilities. So it's a symptom. And in that respect, Alzheimer's disease, amongst the things that it causes dementia as a class of symptoms. However, As we said with the previous way of understanding the distinction, those who favor this approach are quickly going to point out that other conditions besides Alzheimer's disease can likewise cause dementia. They can cause symptoms of memory erosion and perceptual decline and other cognitive dysfunction. But there's a subtle difference in the way that the word would be used in this case if we're favoring the symptom approach. And that would be as follows. Unlike the previous word usage, where dementia was referring to a general category of condition, and then Alzheimer's was one specific instance of that general category, similar to respiratory virus and the flu, or respiratory virus and the cold. In this case, it's something a little bit closer to the word congestion. So congestion is a symptom that can be caused by influenza. It can be caused by the common cold. So now we have a symptom, namely congestion, let's say respiratory congestion, that is associated with multiple different conditions, like influenza, like the common cold. So in a similar way, if we think of dementia as a symptom or as a constellation of symptoms, a group of them, then we would say that not only does Alzheimer's disease have dementia as a symptom or a block of symptoms, but so do other things. For example, traumatic brain injury might have the same constellation of symptoms or a similar one. Lewy-Body Dementia may have a similar constellation of symptoms, and so on. But on the second way of drawing the distinction, of course, we would see that if dementia is a symptom, then Alzheimer's disease is a disease or a condition. So since a disease and a condition is not the same as a symptom, we see that the two word usages come apart. And this would be in a similar way as, say, the word rash and the word chickenpox. If chickenpox refers to a particular condition, then rash is a symptom of that condition, but a rash can also be a symptom of some other condition besides chickenpox. Chickenpox isn't the only thing that causes a rash, but it is one condition that does cause a rash. Right? So you might also get a rash from an allergic reaction. Now when I survey the information that's available to me just quickly, the quick Google search, and I'll flip through my Merck manual. So when we distinguish between symptom and condition, that seems to be the most prominent way of drawing the distinction. The Merck manual does that. The website Healthline seems to draw the distinction that way. The Alzheimer's Association seems to have the same language in its brief article on the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. As does the United Kingdom's Alzheimer's Society. And finally, the Mayo Clinic also seems to draw the distinction in terms of an explicit reference to the difference between symptoms and condition. On the other hand, WebMD seems to use the language of generic and specific, and arguably AARP also in their article differentiating Alzheimer's and dementia does the same thing. Is this a distinction without a difference? In a sense, the upshot is simply that dementia and Alzheimer's disease don't precisely pick out the same thing. And if you get that much, it's probably sufficient for most purposes. In many cases, it probably is somewhat irrelevant to iron out precisely what the distinction means in order to get a good handle on certain articles that make a reference to the two words. So it's probably sufficient to simply understand that they pick out two different things. It's also important to recognize that more conditions than just Alzheimer's disease can negatively impact memory, so that a person doesn't make the mistake of believing that every instance of pathologically degraded memory is going to have to be Alzheimer's. There can be other conditions that are associated with that kind of symptom. And at the same time, the difference, though, isn't precisely the same. It's not precisely the same thing when we think of dementia as a general class of condition. That's certainly not the same word usage as thinking of it as a symptom. However, ultimately, does it really matter? No. I mean, many words in the English language have a range of different meanings, and sometimes that range of meanings is very similar. Possibly at the end of the day, then, we could simply say that Alzheimer's disease and dementia are in a similar boat to other words in the English language of that kind. So at the end of the day, I suppose the basic point is that the word dementia doesn't exactly pick out the same thing as the word Alzheimer's disease. Whether you choose to think of it as dementia being a general category of conditions and Alzheimer's being one specific condition under that category, or whether you think of it as dementia being a constellation of symptoms and Alzheimer's disease being one of a variety of different conditions that can cause that symptom, it kind of is 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. ultimately, again, practically speaking, this is going to make very little difference which of the two trajectories you choose to go. It seems like most of the sources, as I said, favor a symptom condition way of understanding it. Just to reiterate once again, Alzheimer's disease on either of the two approaches is a specific disease or condition, and dementia isn't. Whether dementia is a kind of a catch-all for a group of conditions, or whether it is a reference to a specific set of symptoms for particular conditions. Really, again, possibly it's just part of the word's semantic range that it can mean either, or it may simply be so close in terms of word usage that it just isn't worth really bothering about the distinction too much more after that. So hopefully that sheds a little light for you. I hope that if something that I shared with you today was of interest to you or of help to you, that you would please like the video, subscribe to the channel. I invite you to click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you.